Hello, and welcome to part 5 of my series. Today, we're talking about every artist's mortal enemy, hands. And also maybe feet. I know the human hand is a terrifying and also beautiful enigma, but today we're gonna try to conquer that fear. I have some hands here that I drew from referencing my own hand, so before we jump in, I'm gonna go ahead and just let that process video play while I talk a little bit. So the human hand consists of 27 bones, 27 joints, and 34 muscles, as well as many ligaments, tendons, nerves, and blood vessels. Just kidding, I'm not gonna talk about all that shit. I like to draw based on vibes here. Sure, understanding the basics of human anatomy is extremely helpful and honestly encouraged, but I'm not gonna sit here and pretend to know what's going on under my hand skin. Gross. That's for doctors and smart people. And I am neither. Anyway, yes, it's very helpful to understand proper human anatomy, and I do encourage taking the time to learn it. But today's video is just meant to show you how I draw personally, and to hopefully help you get over any fear you have of drawing hands. Because I, too, was once an artist who did everything I could to hide my character's hands. I feel like everybody went through that phase of just avoiding hands like the plague. Okay, so obviously one of the scariest things about hands is how many different ways you can draw them. There's basically an infinite amount of poses and variations of hands. Everybody has different types of hands. It's a little intimidating, but as long as you have a process that can kind of help you break down the more complicated bits, I promise it's a lot less intimidating. So I'm gonna show you a technique that I use when I'm feeling less than confident about drawing the hand, and hopefully that will help you a little bit. So I'm going to use another photo of my own hand as a reference here, and I'm just going to draw right over the top of it to kind of help illustrate what I visualize while I'm drawing. So first things first, I'm going to go ahead and turn the opacity down just so you can see what I'm doing a little bit easier. So I usually start with the palm of the hand, and I draw this kind of tilted box shape. It's not a perfect box because you'll notice that the palm is a little bit taller on one side, and it kind of slants downward a little bit with the slope of the base of the fingers. So let's just draw that shape. After the palm, I kind of like to map out my thumb because it kind of acts as another guide for me. So sometimes I'll start with this like little triangle situation here, and that kind of just helps illustrate like this bit of muscle that you have around the thumb. Actually, typically I think I like it to be a little bit shorter because right at the top of this triangle here is where your first visible knuckle is going to be. So to indicate that, I'm just going to draw a little circle like that. Now obviously this is a photo of my own hand, and my fingers are kind of long and weird, especially my thumbs. So feel free to draw this however you want. Obviously you can reference your own hand or you can reference somebody else's hand. But this is just kind of how I draw because I draw based off of what I see every day, which is my weird hand. So from this knuckle here, we're gonna draw a line upward to meet where our other knuckle would be. And then one more to the top of the thumb. These are about the same length. I think this might be a little bit longer, this section here. But that's gonna kind of act as our guide and like the skeleton for our thumb. So from there, I like to map out where the start of the rest of the knuckles would be. So you've got the top of the palm here. Now, interestingly, the very first knuckle in each finger is not actually above the palm. It's kind of just sitting right inside the palm there. So we'll go ahead and draw all of those. Then just like we did with the thumb, we'll go ahead and take a line up to meet our next knuckle. Do the same thing up to the top knuckle and the top of the finger. So these two sections are about the same length, and then obviously the tip of your finger is much shorter than the rest of your finger. So make sure to keep that pretty short and small, and these two about the same length. So let's go ahead and do that for the rest of the fingers. And obviously it's important to keep in mind the length of fingers. So typically your pointer finger here is going to be shorter than these two, or at least shorter than the middle finger, but still taller than the pinky. The pinky and the thumb are going to be your smallest fingers. Again, this is going to depend on everybody's hand because everybody's hand is vastly different. But in my case, and in a lot of people's case, you have these two middle fingers, which are going to be the longest, then your pointer, then your pinky, then probably your thumb. But for me, my thumb and my pinky are both pretty long. Anyway, keeping these sections about the same length. Knuckle here, and then the tip. Okay, so now we have our little skeleton base. Just draw a wrist there so we know what we're working with. So let's go ahead and turn off the picture here, and this is kind of what we're left with, which looks a little bit funny, I know, but just trust the process. This is a really good base layer just to kind of help map out the hand. I find that this technique really works for me if I'm struggling to place fingers or if I'm trying to draw a hand holding something and it's just not really working out. So after we have all of that mapped out, then we can kind of come in and encase these beautiful little bones in a cozy little flesh prison. It is helpful to remember to add a little bit more, I don't want to use the word girth, but add a little bit more, I guess, flesh around the knuckles, because your knuckles are a little bit wider than the rest of your bone. So that kind of also helps just make it look more like a hand, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is if you add a little bit more width. That's a word I could have used, width around the knuckles. And then obviously it kind of tapers off toward the tip of the finger there. We'll go ahead and just add that in for all of the fingers. And then come down to meet our palm. So that's kind of what we're left with, and then you can start cleaning up the inner lines. And it'll start to look a little bit more like a hand. Awesome. And there you have a hand. Add some lines there if you want. Again, I know my thumb tends to be like kind of long and almost finger-like, and that's not super typical across people's hands, but just draw them however you want to draw them or closer to your own hands. So let's go ahead and draw another hand using this same technique. Let's go ahead and draw this hand maybe showing like the back of the hand a little bit. So we've got a knuckle here, 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 and here. I'm not going to use reference this time. Also this time the thumb is going to be potentially hidden behind the palm. Let's just first kind of going based off vibes here, so let's see if these make sense. Also, when you're drawing the back of the hand, it's helpful to kind of continue the line of the finger further onto the palm, even though you wouldn't on the other side, because even though you don't see the knuckle as well, you'll still see kind of the skin that encases the knuckle right here. And then this pinky is kind of coming forward a little bit and blocking view of some of that finger. And then our palm. Let's go ahead and erase and clean up some of this and see if what I drew even makes sense. Yeah, kinda. Looks a little funky right now. I am going to envision the thumb being kind of behind the palm, sort of like the hand is coming down like this, so the thumb is just resting. So I'll draw like a little bit of extra muscle here and a line to indicate a separation, but the thumb is going downward, so you won't see all of it. So, my favorite part, honestly, I think is drawing the fingernails, and that is, I feel like fingernails are a lot like eyebrows, in that the way that you draw them is really going to have an effect on the whole piece. So fingernails can help indicate that a finger is turned a certain way or turned away from you by the way that you draw them. So these fingers are kind of coming down and the tip is facing more towards the floor, or maybe it's almost bent inward a little bit. And part of what helps that visualization is drawing the cuticle or the end of the fingernail curved outward like that. So for example, if the finger was curved upward a little bit more, I might draw it like this. And then it's crazy how much that kind of changes it. It makes it seem like that finger is coming upward a little bit more compared to the rest of the fingers. Hopefully that's making sense. But because that's not the way that I want that to look, I'm gonna go back to the curved bit there. And now that kind of looks like it's, again, pointing more towards the ground. Okay, so there's another hand. It looks kind of weird. I think maybe had I drawn a thumb, it would have looked a little bit less like a dinosaur claw thing. But anyway, now that we have our kind of guide technique figured out, let's go ahead and move on. So I don't always draw with this method. A lot of the time I just draw the outside of the hand because I've gotten pretty comfortable with the process. I've drawn hands enough times that I don't feel as intimidated by them as I used to. And because of this, I also have a pretty stylized way of drawing hands that's slightly different from like this more, not that this is realistic, but the way that I draw hands is more simplified than this. Just because I have a pretty simple art style, it's kind of cartoonish, so I like to try to match the hands to the rest of my style so that way they blend with the drawing. Otherwise it would look kind of weird if my characters looked pretty whimsical and then the hands all of a sudden just looked weirdly real and wrinkly. Basically, I kind of add the fingernails and, maybe like a line here to indicate the muscly part of the thumb, but then that's it. I don't usually add like wrinkles in the middle of the palm or like these wrinkles here around the knuckles. Because when you start adding too many lines and wrinkles and details and stuff, it kind of just starts to complicate the figure and it might not really match the rest of your art style. Basically, the less lines, the better if you're trying to simplify your hands. All right, so let's go ahead and draw maybe a hand holding something. Let's get a little fancy, and this time let's try drawing a hand holding a mug. But this time I'm not going to trace over it. I'm just going to do my best to use it as reference and kind of show you guys my process here. So for something like this, I think the first thing that I would want to do is block out the big shapes, one of which being the mug, of course. Doesn't have to be super perfect in the beginning. And then let's go ahead and block out part of the hand. Okay, so we have our shapes just kind of blocked out here. Now we know the thumb is probably going to be the easiest thing to start with, just because that one isn't really too different than how we would normally draw. Got our big fleshy bit right here, and then the end of the thumb there. Now, let's do the pointer finger, which is coming all the way around. You know, it looks like maybe the mug is a little too close, so I'm gonna scooch it away a little bit. That way we've got a little more room to draw that pointer finger. The rest of the handle there, and then the other fingers are kind of just resting under it. Okay. Now here is a good example of where I'm gonna simplify things a little bit to match my style. So obviously my real hand has a lot of wrinkles and there's a lot of bends and folds in the fingers, but the more of those that I draw in this drawing, obviously the more kind of realistic it's gonna start to look, and it's gonna feel really far off from the rest of the drawing if I was drawing like a whole illustration. So I'm kind of just gonna work off of the reference to the best of my ability while strategically leaving out some details, if that makes sense. So let's go ahead and add in our fingernail. That is definitely a detail that we want in there. And let's see. Definitely the fingers here. We'll probably soften up the bend of the fingers just a little bit, make them a little bit less angular. And simplify the pinky a little bit there. Let's see. So these fingers are curving in a lot more than this one is, which means I'm gonna go ahead and bend the start of the nail much more than I would up here. So it's kind of like a more of a U shape the more the finger bends. And it'll also be a little bit shorter. The more that the finger is bent, you'll see obviously a lot less nail. So we'll want that to look a little bit shorter. Okay. Let's go ahead and adjust this one just a little bit. Okay, and then we can kind of follow the curve of these fingers with the muscly bit of the thumb there. Okay, and then also, just to kind of match my style, one of the ways that I change it is that I draw them a lot more curvy than maybe the real life reference would be. So this is a pretty straight line for the most part, but to match my art style, I've added a little bit more of a curve going on here. A little bit more stylized and like dramatic than it should be. But that's about all of the detail that I would add, honestly. Maybe a little line there. And then there we have it. So that's kind of the way that I draw hands for the most part, is I just kind of go straight into drawing the outside of the hand. But if I didn't have a reference, or if I was just really struggling with this particular pose, the best way for me to get around that would be to just imagine the knuckles again, and you can kind of draw them behind, and that would help you get a better visual for the way that the fingers kind of wrap around something. Hopefully that was helpful, and hopefully it made sense. And also, hopefully this looks like a hand. So, moving on to feet for just a quick minute. I'm not really going to touch on feet too much, just because I don't really draw feet all that often, to be honest. I'll be the first to admit, I still hate drawing feet. I am nearly 30 years old, and I still hate them. Most of the time, my characters have shoes on, which I also hate drawing, or I'm drawing mermaids, and mermaids don't have feet. Which is a little tip: if you hate drawing feet, draw more mermaids. The way that I would draw feet, though, let's imagine you have your calf coming down to a slightly thinner ankle area. And then usually what I like to do is I add a little cap, just right there at the end. That is kind of my marker for the ankle, so that I know if I've been working on the feet too long and I just keep changing and rearranging, sometimes I can really accidentally lengthen or shorten the leg too much. So having this marker here lets me know if I've drawn the foot like way too low, or if I've drawn it like way too high, then I'm like, oh, where'd her ankles go? So that's one tip that I have for drawing feet. So obviously we'll draw feet from the side, and feet are obviously kind of like hands in that they have sort of a palm area, like the sole of your foot, and then you have short, stubby fingers, basically. They're like weird cousins to hands. So starting from the ankle, there's usually a little bit of a slope downward, and I kind of imagine drawing duck feet at first. I don't draw any of the details in the very beginning. I draw the slope downward, and then kind of a plateau here, and then I curve around, and I've got a flat line, and then you have kind of a curve that comes out and down, and that'll be kind of like the heel of your foot. So kind of draw Barbie feet from the beginning. Don't draw too much detail, just get the basic shape down, and then when you're comfortable with that, you can go in and add detail. So this is a side view, obviously. I'm gonna go ahead and add whatever curves would be there. Kind of got the, what is this, the ball of your foot? Right before your toes start. And then right here would be your toe. So I also, just like my hands, my feet are kind of weird. They're very large, just like my hands, and I have kind of long finger-like toes. I'm not gonna show those for free, by the way. So the way that I draw feet for my characters tends to resemble my own feet, but again, just draw what you're comfortable drawing with. Base it off your own feet, or somebody's feet that you know, I don't know. Just draw them however you want. I like to think of the big toe, I think, as just like a little chubby thumb. A little bigger thumb. And then I draw the toenail, and from this angle you might see the tops of some of the other toes. That at least kind of helps give it the visualization that there are other things going on the other side of the toe. And then, once you're comfortable, you can erase that guideline and add like a little indication of ankle bone there. Ankle bone? I don't know if that's the technical term. I'm not a doctor! Okay. That is my very basic foot tutorial. I would do a more in-depth tutorial on the feet, but frankly, I don't feel comfortable enough doing that just because I don't draw feet often enough. Most of the time it's just a guessing game with my pencil and my eraser until it looks vaguely enough like a foot. Sorry. So on to finally drawing the hands on our character that we've been working on. It's funny, I actually really struggled with this hand, and it's kind of a good example of more of my process, I guess, and how I kind of navigate through a rough time. Because really it's just, like I keep saying, a matter of erasing and redrawing and erasing and redrawing, and that's exactly what I did here. I did it like a million times, it felt like, and at one point I was even like, you know, maybe I should step back and come back to this like a little while later. Maybe I'm just not capable of this right now. But sometimes you just have to work through that, and then you'll find that eventually it works out. It just takes some frustration and some erasing. And also it's kind of funny because I was thinking, when we do the next video, which will be the last video in this series, and we'll be working on her clothes, I'm like, she might even have her hands in pockets, so I don't even know if her hands will be visible, but I still thought it was worthwhile to draw her hands just in case, because maybe I don't want her hands to be in pockets, maybe she's wearing a dress or something and she just has her hands on her hips. But regardless, you know, I wanted to give this character some hands. And it took a few tries, and maybe they're not my best hands, but maybe that makes you feel a little bit better if you kind of watch me struggle a little bit. We can't win them all, right? Anyway, I hope this video was helpful to some of you, and I hope that it maybe even helped you feel a little bit less hesitant about drawing hands, because while I understand the fear around drawing them, I do think they have the easiest solution, which of course is to just draw them more often. And I think drawing hands more often should be a super easy thing to do, considering you or someone you know likely has one or two hands that you can use as a reference. So just take some photos of you holding random objects or at different angles and start practicing. I promise once you get comfortable drawing hands, it's actually a lot of fun. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.